Hi, everyone. This is episode 41 of Getting Everyone Moving by Palms to Pines Parasports. And today we have Professor Dennis Frost. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you. So, how did you get involved in Japan and disability and Paralympics and such?
And I'll backtrack a little bit from the current project because my interest in Japan actually came out of my college experience. I had not really had much exposure to Japan when I first started college. In fact, very minimal, and ended up kind of on a whim taking a Japanese class and then taking a Japanese religion class. And before I knew it, I was kind of hooked. And then spent a year in Japan. My junior year, I was in Japan for a whole year. And fell in love with the history, particularly the history of Japan, and said, I was planning to be a lawyer when I left to go out and study abroad. And by the time I came back, I was like, I think I want to spend the rest of my life studying this place. Uh, and so I spent a little bit of time after that in Japan after I graduated, a couple years, and then ended up at graduate school at Columbia, where I did a dissertation on the history of sports stars. So sports celebrity in Japan. I started back with sumo wrestling, as late as the 1600s, and brought it up to the present. I ended the book at the time. It was with Ichiro. It was the present. He was still playing in the United States at that point. And so that's kind of where I got started in the disability or in the history side, the Japanese history side. My focus on disability, and I mentioned this briefly in the introduction of the book. Was a student. I was teaching a class, and it was a class called Sports in East Asia, and I still teach that class on a regular basis. And one of the students, and this was right after I was finishing the dissertation at the time, and so deeply embedded in this earlier project on sports history in Japan, very familiar with sports in Japan. And a student asked me about if they could do a presentation. They were doing group presentations, and one of the groups wanted to do something on the Nagano Paralympics. And I was like, sure. I'm like, why do I not know about this? And that was kind of the inspiration. That was, so that was back like 2006, I think 2006, right? Was when that happened, 2005, 2006. And I was still in the process of the other book. So I finished that one up and then was like, maybe I should look into this more. And my first trip to Japan for this project, the current book project was 2011, right after the earthquake. I was there in June, and that had been March. And so was there doing research in Japan, gathering information. They hadn't won the bid for the Olympics and Paralympics yet. So, that was kind of not on the horizon. So it ended up becoming, way more timely than I anticipated. Given the fact that they won the bid, 2 years later, and then, there's been all this preparation for the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics coming up here. So that's kind of the intellectual side of kind of how it came about.
Yeah. Well, so talk about the book then. What are some of your findings? I've spoken to Mark Bookman a little bit about his experience, being a person with disability and living in Japan. But yeah, talk a bit about the book, please.
Yeah, so the book is set up to look at, the goal is to understand the broader history of disability sports in Japan. So sports for people with disabilities. And really that's in many ways a post-World War II phenomenon in Japan, like it is in a lot of other places. There are examples of it before that. But really the movement that we associate with the Paralympics today is really a post-war phenomenon. And so it's to understand how that has happened in Japan, how it's developed in Japan. And in particular, to understand that, I decided to focus on international events that have been held in Japan for people with disabilities. And so the first of those was the 1964 Paralympics. And one of the things that I point out in the book is that when this idea was first proposed in Japan, nobody even knew what the Paralympics was. It was still at the time, even in Europe, it was still new enough that it was kind of not like widely known. But in Japan, they had never had an athlete participate before in it. Before 1960 when it's first proposed. And so the fact that they even hold the games, 4 years later, less than 4 years is what it ends up being, is pretty remarkable. And so that's kind of one of the first things I start with is kind of that's the beginning of this movement in Japan. And then Japan really, one of the things that most surprised me about this is in part because a lot of when Japanese people talk about this and Japanese scholars talk about this, they often kind of talk about it in terms of Japan was behind and Japan has been behind and Japan is always behind in disability sports. Well, the reality is that if you look at things, they're ahead of the curve in so many ways. It's particularly in terms of thinking about, in 1964, Japan was only the second place outside of England to host these games. these international events. They've mostly been held in England up to that point, and then Rome. And so Japan is like the second place. And then it doesn't happen again in connection with the Olympics until 1988. And then they develop other events, like the FISPIC games that are started in Japan in 1975, which are essentially like a regional version of the Paralympics in the Far East South Pacific region. That's what FISPIC stands for, Far East South Pacific Games. And then there's the Oita Wheelchair Marathon, which I also talk about in the book, which is started in 1981. And some of your listeners may actually be familiar with the event because they may have competed in it. It's the world's largest wheelchair-only event, and now one of the few that actually is available for athletes with higher levels of impairment to compete in at the international level. And so it's this remarkable world-class event. It brings the best athletes to Japan. This town, kind of remote area in Japan, hard to get to actually. And so that's a fascinating story that I wanted to tell as well. And it's still going on. It's 40. They're supposed to have their 40th race this past year. And of course, like with COVID, they had a race, but it was all local, not international. Yeah. So it's been like and I could talk more about that. And I'm happy to answer more questions about the book. But those are some of the kind of things that really struck me in the process of developing this, and looking in particular at broader issues of how sports development has continued to be promoted in Japan. And then also accessibility, things like that, or other things that I've been kind of talking about and thinking about in the book.
So with the Paralympics coming up, hopefully this summer,
hopefully
along with the Olympics, do you, in your research, have you found that Japanese society is open to promoting adaptive athletics? That people are generally aware of, athletes with a disability?
I think that is something that has changed pretty dramatically in Japan. I would say really in the last decade or so. I mentioned my first research trip in 2011 for this project. I was working mostly with places that were familiar with this because I was going to, it was called JSAT at the time, Japan Sports Association for the Disabled. It's now Japan Parasports Association, I think is what they have changed their name to. But I was working with them. And so, of course, they were familiar with these events and the things I was talking about. But when I would have conversations with broader people outside of just the archival sites I was visiting, I was having to explain what I was talking about. And, then in 2017, when I was there, myself and my family, we were fortunate enough to be able to spend 6 months living in Tokyo, where I was doing some research, particularly on kind of the upcoming games, and attending a lot of events. And that was a very different feeling. I would I would tell taxi drivers what I was working on, and they would say, "Oh yeah, like they've been doing a lot of work on the Paralympics. Yeah, it's interesting." And went and visited my host family down in Osaka, because from the first time I was in Japan, went and visited them in Osaka. And I mentioned the project, and they were like, "Oh," and then so we had a short discussion with them about it. And so there was me just saying what I was working on. Then they could bring their pieces, and that's a really different feeling. And again, I think it's very much tied to Promotion 2020. They've been really active, and really embracing the athletes, bringing the athletes into the discussion, into the process, into the promotion process in particular. And I think that's had a big impact. It's also, it was striking to see just how omnipresent it was in Japan in 2017. I remember I was taking a flight somewhere, and I was just at the airport, and the television was on. Like there's always televisions on right around airports, and they happened to have it tuned into I think it was the world what is it, the para athletics competition, I think. Yeah, and so I want to say they were in like Dubai that year or something. Like it was not someplace, it wasn't in Japan. It was an international competition being broadcast in Japan on the airport television, and it's what they were watching at the airport. So that just that kind of that's remarkable. And then in terms of broader promotion, you have the Nippon Foundation and their Japan Parasports Center has done a remarkable job of promoting stuff. And and the amount of money alone that they poured into this is something that is remarkable and unprecedented in kind of the broader history compared to what I saw in earlier periods.
I recently saw some Paralympic Anime.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah.
And I was amazed by that. I
yes.
thought. So it seems like it really is getting out there to the general public.
Yeah, and so there's the anime, there's manga that have been developed, and they've been, a lot of this is kind of in conjunction, Nippon Foundation, their para support center. I forget the exact title. It's not on the tip of my tongue right now, but they provide a lot of kind of support and have kind of coordinated a lot of this. But you also have like NHK, I think is where you maybe saw those anime.
Yeah.
And they've actually, provided Japanese translations of them, or English translations of the Japanese, and are marketing them more broadly. And so, I think that's a huge service that Japan's doing. And that kind of goes back to the point I was making, that there's this idea that Japan has been behind. And then part of what I hope the book does is kind of lets people know that, well, it looks like it's behind because if you didn't tell the stories, and the story isn't known, then it looks that way, but it's not. And there's always you can improve stuff. I don't want to make that sound like that's the case. It's definitely the case everywhere. But yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that Japan has done in connection with these games that is going to be beneficial in the long run for para sports and the Paralympic movement in general.
So what about, some of us do know about the Paralympic athletes, I mean, the elite athletes.
Right.
But what about in Japan for, the more recreational athletes? I recently saw a movie, Japanese movie with English subtitles called Kick, about power soccer. And again, those were elite athletes, but what about for those recreational athletes? I mean, are there NGOs that are forming in Japan to help, just get people moving?
Yeah, there is. And I mean, this is something that I wish, again, partly because the focus of the book ends up being kind of this big international level. The early history of it, of course, is all recreational, rehabilitational, right? Like most sports, para sports everywhere and adapted sports everywhere. That was the focus initially. And the elite level is something that's come out really since, I want to say, the 90s in Japan. But there is a remarkable number of facilities locally. And there's new studies that are coming out, and I think there's more and more opportunities like this, that there's facilities that are promoting these programs, and they're not all tied to the Paralympics and things. So for example, you have in Oita, there's the Taiyo no Ie, which is, I talk about this in the book. It's a factory that's established in the aftermath of the Tokyo 64 games, that is designed and to be a community for people with disabilities to work and live. And they have gym facilities that are open to the public. And so there's places like that. You also have, specifically designated sites in Osaka and Tokyo. Big cities, of course, have these. But even places like Nagano, which had the Paralympics in '98, the Winter Games, they have facilities that are kind of developed. And there's a lot of local organizations that have emerged. And some of these are older, and some of them are kind of more recent. So it's one of those things when you start looking for it, it's there. The trick that I think is the case, and this is, I think, true in the United States too, based on some of my experiences, that you're not going to know it's there until you look for it, because it doesn't get the notice of other types of organizations. And so you really have to look. I was actually just looking at for the Michigan Challenge Games, or Victory Games, I think what they're called today. It's essentially like track and field events, and was looking for that, and I was like trying to find it. It took me a few minutes, and I feel like I'm kind of more connected than a lot of other people are to those questions. So I think it's the same in Japan. And I know they're really actively working to train people now, to train specialists and people to serve as coaches. And they're, one of the goals, and this is something I talked about at the end of the book, what was referred to as the 2021 problem at the time, which now suggests something very different. But the 2021 problem was this idea of how do you sustain the impact of the games beyond 2020? And so one of the things that scholars were talking about that I referenced in the book is this idea of training at different levels. So of course you want to train coaches and people to do adapted sports, but you also need to embed this into education curriculums for PE teachers, into nursing programs, so that when they encounter a student who has a disability or a patient who has a disability or some sort of impairment of any sort, that then you can kind of say, oh, well, I may not be able to help you kind of figure out how to do these sports, but I can point you to where they are. And so that's something that, I know that they're working on. And I suspect that, that's where, if we see a legacy of the Paralympics, on the smaller scale, that's where it's going to come. It's going to come in those types of efforts that have been going on all along, but are maybe gaining some steam because of the publicity of the games.
So your book, From Patients to Pros, the Paralympic Movement, Disability in Sports and Postwar Japan, when is it actually going to be released?
Oh, it actually has a different title now. So that's an older
Okay.
title.
Okay. Let's
So
see.
it's actually out now. So it's called More Than Medals, A History of the Paralympics and Disability Sports in Post-War Japan. And that's a title, I've used that title initially, and I used it for some talks. But it's actually out. It came out January 15th, I think, was the official release date. And it is now, I think for a while it got hung up and shipping got delayed. So like Amazon didn't have it in stock, but it's now kind of in stock most places and available. Okay. So it is available now.
Okay, good. You have to change your CV then, okay?
Oh yeah, I think I need. Yeah, the one on my website is. Yeah. It's not the most recent one. I think that I got it updated at the beginning of the year, and the title changed since then. So.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah, no problem. So when you look at the U.S. kind of compared to Japan in terms of adaptive sports, I mean, is Japan and U.S. kind of on the same level in terms of promoting, in terms of opportunities and such?
That's a great question. And I will say, to be fair to the US, I don't study it in quite the same way.
Yeah.
My experience is much more localized in the US. And again, I mentioned this in the book, and I've mentioned this in a couple of other interviews I've given, that my youngest son plays wheelchair tennis and also does sled hockey on a team here in Grand Rapids, which is about 45 minutes north of us. So my experience is very kind of local in that sense. So it's hard for me to kind of relate the two. I will say, having, like I said, lived in Japan for 6 months and been studying this project for, a while now, the response to like the Paralympics at the elite level is definitely different. I mean, Japan is, I think in some ways ahead of the US, particularly in terms of media coverage. I think they was seeing something just the other day that they were celebrating the fact that we're going to have primetime coverage of the Paralympics for Tokyo. Yeah. I'm like, well, yeah, that should have been happening a long time ago. But, and that in 1964, there was actually primetime coverage of the Paralympic Games in Tokyo. Yeah. So it wasn't a ton, but, that was 1964 that Japan was offering primetime coverage of some of the events. And so there's things like that I think are different. In terms of access, I think that some of the programs, and my experience is kind of much more from kind of what I know from people we interact with and in the US. So I know that there are opportunities at like the college level and things like that from what I understand are not yet available at the Japanese level. Yeah. And so, I'm thinking of like, the University of Illinois has a, terrific program in adapted sports. And then you've got like University of Arizona and Alabama, and, U of M is starting to kind of develop a program. Yeah. These are all partly because like my son is starting to think about colleges and stuff like that. So it's like, so they're on my radar. And my sense is that, again, I didn't look at that question particularly in Japan, but I think that is not quite the same level. And part of that is that the sports systems in general are just structured differently. I think that it's part of a broader kind of difference between the two systems. And it'd be interesting to, maybe in a future project, I can kind of dig more into that kind of, the next tier down from the elite level sports to look at this. There are, like I said, a surprising number of competitions and events and things like that happen in Japan. And so in that sense, I think they're probably more similar. But again, it's probably, you almost have to know about it to be kind of plugged into it. Yeah. And I think that's probably true in both places to a certain extent.
So you have a personal connection with the world of adaptive sports. What your son, what is his disability?
So he was born with spina bifida, and so he uses, particularly for distance and kind of at school and things like that, uses a wheelchair. And then for sports, he uses wheelchair, like the sled for sled hockey.
Yeah, that's terrific that he plays so much. Good for him.
Yeah.
So has that been part of your motivation though, as to why you have studied, Paralympics and adaptive sports and such?
I think it was a combination, and it's in some ways it made the project really rewarding, and it also made it challenging too, because the academic instinct is to critique, right? And I definitely think there's plenty that needs to be critiqued about the Paralympic movement in general and kind of things and representations and things like that. But it's also I mean, seeing the important role that sports have played for my son and the people on his team, and just, I think it gives you a really different perspective, and kind of hopefully kind of gave me a more well-rounded perspective in the whole. But it was something that, it kind of intersected at the same time I was looking for a new project to start working on. That was around the same time he was starting to take an interest in sports, and it was going to be clear that that we weren't going to be able to just go to the little league team locally, that we were going to need to look for something more adapted. And so fortunately we live here in Kalamazoo, which and there's a great, Mary Freebed has a terrific wheelchair adapted sports program.
Yeah.
And so, we've been pretty involved with them. He goes most summers is at a camp, a week-long camp where they do all sorts of sports and activities. And so that's, so it's been kind of it has been kind of personal, and that's kind of been a factor that's kept me interested. And it also, when we were in Tokyo, that meant that, he was getting to meet Paralympians, and he was getting to, because, I would meet people and interview them, and we'd go to their events, and, and that's just something that was pretty unique for him. And all of us combined. But I think in particular for him, it was pretty neat experience that is not always the case. It's actually interesting. I'm blanking his name, Daniel Romanchuk, I think, is like one of the world's best wheelchair racers right now. And it's interesting because when my son's first tournament in sled hockey, in national tournament, they actually his team played against his team in the finals and lost. So he's actually met him, but I don't think necessarily before he was kind of a big wheelchair marathoner. Yeah. So that it's, it is, in some ways it's also a really small community that when, especially the farther up you get into the kind of the rankings here, you kind of know everybody or kind of have met a lot of different people. And that's one of the great things about kind of in doing the research in Japan, meeting so many people. It was very, I would meet people, and then they would introduce me to somebody else who would introduce me to someone else. And then, I'd get access to some new things that I never would have found otherwise. So that's the community around adapted and disability sports is such a strong community in some ways, and they are really connected.
Yeah.
That people are really supportive of the project and in general.
Yeah. So college, what year in school is your son?
He's just starting into high school. So
Okay.
He's got a little while yet.
Yeah. But, so you mentioned a few of the colleges that have collegiate adaptive level sport programs. It's a few, right? It's a handful. Yeah. So your son, has a choice, obviously, but it's only a few. Do you have any thoughts on how we get more collegiate level adaptive sports in the U.S.?
That's a good question. And I think a lot of it probably is going to end up, just based on kind of how, some of the things I have looked at in other places, it often develops through kind of consortiums or kind of partnerships with organizations that have the tools and the resources to do that. So like a place like Mary Freebed, working with a local, university to kind of provide support, because I think a lot of places, they are not in a position to provide the resources and the training and the staff to do a full-fledged adapted sports program. So you need to have kind of other opportunities for students to take advantage of it. And that's, looking at what U of M sounds like, and they're a fairly new program from what I understand. And it looks like they are, working not just with students on their campus, but kind of opening it up to the broader community in order to get kind of more people involved and to provide access, which is, I think, always a key question, right? How do you get people to kind of form teams is one part, but it's also opening it up so that more people have access, so that it's not just limited to, just students who are at U of M, but you're saying Eastern students and, students at some of the local community colleges who might be interested in doing adaptive sports are going to be able to join their programs. And I think that's a very different model from the way that college sports has traditionally operated in the US. And so that in and of itself, I think is part of the barrier, perhaps, that, you have to think about. Those programs have to be more open and kind of to students who aren't enrolled. And so that, and again, I'm not an expert in this by any stretch, but I imagine that complicates things for the hosting program.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think is so it's going to be programs like that that are probably opening up and more accessible, but there is complicating factors that I'm sure are part of the challenges of doing them.
Yeah. Does your son feel as if, he can do anything? That, okay, he might have spinal bifida, but I'm going to still go, I'm going to play whatever sports I want to play. I'm going to do what I want to in life. Have you and your wife, your family been able to kind of inculcate those kind of, desires in him?
I think so. It's always, I think it's also tempered by reality, and that we've made it very clear that if he wants to do something, we'll try and find a way to make it happen. And I think generally we've met with support from that in a lot of other places, but it's also I mean, I think it's also like he's also aware of the barriers that are there in society, partly because we talk about them, because I study them, and we think about kind of the fact that if there are no stairs or there are no elevators, then you can't go up that staircase with the wheelchair. And there are places in the U.S. where that's still very much a reality. And there, even at the school in Tokyo where he was based, he went to a local school, and it was a school that he had to climb stairs to get to his classroom, and he said he was willing to do that. And so we did, but that was, it would have meant going to a completely different school outside of our neighborhood. And so different kind of set of obstacles and barriers there. But that was something that, and in the US too, I don't want to say that Japan is the only place that has schools without elevators, right?
Yeah.
Or places without elevators. Having traveled in New York City not that long ago, it was a while ago now, just shocked by how hard it was to get around. And even I was in Toronto for the Paralympic Anime games with my sons, and it was kind of at various points I was like, okay, I guess we took the wrong exit. So now we'll either have to go back and backtrack, or we're gonna have to just, you climb the stairs, I'll carry the chair up until we get to the top. So I think, and in terms of like sports and things like that, I think there's similar barriers that there's going to be, he's probably not going to play on the high school basketball team at his high school, right? Because he might be able to be involved in some way, but that's not going to be, because that's not going to work. That's not an up-down basketball team, right? So thinking about those kinds of things, like tempered by reality, but kind of the sense of like, if you want to do something, we'll find a way to make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have other children too?
Yeah, I have another son.
Mm-hmm. And what year is he in school?
He's a junior, so he'll be headed to college even sooner. So.
Okay. And so have they, one of the things that I've talked to a number of the people that I've interviewed about is the importance of having siblings participate in, adaptive sports. And, to me, it's a bigger issue. It's how do we create a more inclusive society? So has that happened in your family? Has your other son?
Yeah, we, some up-down tennis stuff. And then also, it depends, like on the sled hockey team, the team itself is he's not really on that team, but there's been a few events where he's gone and kind of tried the sled, and he doesn't particularly like ice skating, so he's not a hockey player himself. So he doesn't necessarily want to go skate with him and play hockey with him. If he were, I think it'd be a different scenario. Yeah. So I think that, but yeah, that idea, and they talk about, well, I mean, they're both going to be on the tennis team next year. So the high school tennis team together. So, and so like talking about training this summer and things like that. And I think that, that is something that ways to kind of incorporate those kind of your up-down experiences, or like you said, inclusive and approaches to sports are something that I, especially kind of thinking again about my own research, that's something I know that they're discussing in Japan a lot more, and thinking about kind of ways to do that. And I know that that's also true in the US in a lot of places. And so I've been to a couple up-down tennis tournaments and, seen those and then, yeah, and those are, I think great experiences. I'm not a tennis player myself, so if I played, it would be bad for the person I was playing with. Really, I would be the negative partner there in that case for sure.
So you're both your sons' high school tennis team then. So how are they doing competition with your son who uses a wheelchair?
We've not had that yet. So that'll be next year. Yeah, we'll find out next year how it's going to work. We know that in our area, there's been a couple of students who played on like JV teams in our area. We have a number of really strong tennis teams. Like some of the top teams in the state are right in our area. So even really good tennis players often end up at the JV level in our region, or at the kind of, their number 4 doubles kind of thing. So I think it will see what it looks like this coming year. But so far, again, like we've met with, most people seem to be supportive of trying to figure out how to make it work. I'm sure that that's not always the case in a lot of places. And, so I feel like we're pretty fortunate to have benefited from the local support. So
yeah, that's terrific.
At least at this point. Mm-hmm.
That's terrific. Broad question, Dennis. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do we create a more inclusive society? What more do we have to do?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I think a big part of it is information and getting information out to people. And I don't think knowledge is not always the solution to everything, because, but right now, one of the things I feel that is most a barrier to is that people just don't know about the options that are out there for people that do have disabilities, that the things that sometimes that people are doing with disabilities. So then when they do encounter someone who has a disability, who's doing something, it becomes this kind of, wow, that's so inspirational, when in fact, they're just living their lives and doing what, other people are doing. And so, I think there is a barrier there in terms of knowledge and access to information. So I think that's one thing. There's also all sorts of policy stuff that could be implemented all over the place, at different levels. And I'm going to, perhaps kind of reveal my politics here, but, better access to healthcare is a huge thing. You shouldn't have to kind of like fight with an insurance company to get access to good rehabilitation practices that are going to help you after you've had some sort of injury, or even if you have a kind of just it's part of your life, right? I mean, people need rehabilitation in various forms at different points. And so that shouldn't be a barrier, but it is. And so, I think that that's another thing. And then I would also say, and again, some of this is, coming out of my research in particular, but just opportunities have to be there, and you have to have people that are willing to kind of say, okay, we're going to create these opportunities, and that's not a policy thing per se. Like you can mandate, that you have X number of people, and Japan essentially does, right? They have hiring quotas and things like that. There's flaws with that approach. Because was a big scandal earlier a couple of years ago now in Japan about kind of people inflating their figures to kind of, so they didn't have to they could fit the quotas. But so you can mandate stuff like that. But I think it also has to be, people have to be willing to kind of take an opportunity or to create those opportunities. And I'm thinking of business and work and things like that, right? In particular, creating spaces and then having facilities that are accessible enough for people to be able to do the work. So those are all policy. Those are some of that's, government stuff, some of it's at the institution level. And then at an individual level, that's where it gets harder, I think. You can give people all this information, you can give them all this stuff, but eventually you have to kind of consume it, and you have to kind of have that kind of different approach and different mindset. And that's one, again, one of the things I wanted to look at was the impact of all these events. And I have to say at the end that, you can say that they've had an impact on people's perceptions, but we don't know that because it's really hard to measure those types of things. So like the Paralympics, has it impacted people's perceptions of people with disabilities? Well, probably, almost certainly. It's really difficult to say how. And I think at the individual level, that's where it becomes really, really difficult to kind of know how to make those changes sometimes.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of our interview. Can you hold up your book again so we can all see it there? That'd be great. Get the correct title. Sorry. Yes.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I forgot it was not updated.
Ooh, that's something I want to read. And so can you leave us with a story from your book with that will give us a good message,
Oh, let's see. There's a number of them. I'll try and think of one that is kind of telling. I'm trying to just think of a specific one here. So there is, I guess maybe I'll give you two quick ones, I guess.
Sure.
Maybe more than one. So the first one is, I interviewed one of the Paralympians from 1964. And so Suzaki Katsumi, and he he told me this story. He was talking about his experience, and that he talked a lot about what he called his failures at the Paralympics, because he had literally had no training beforehand. He was kind of plucked out of the hospital, maybe even a month less than that before the games, and ended up participating in these Olympics or these Paralympics in 1964 in Tokyo. And so he was telling me the story of how he had not really, one of his events was swimming, and he had trained mostly essentially doing rehabilitation work at the hospital in a hot springs, because he's in Beppu, which is very famous for its hot springs. And so then he gets to the Paralympics and gets into the pool and is shocked by how cold it was. So that's kind of an example of kind of where the Paralympics started in 1964. A very different scenario than like today, where you have kind of Paralympians that are kind of, world-class athletes that train year round, essentially professionals, which is where the original title came from, right? From patients to pros. And then the other thing I'll just mention is, and again, partly because they're bookends in some ways, nice bookends. When the Paralympics were being bid for in 2013, the main spokesperson, the first person who spoke at the final Olympic bid kind of presentation ceremony was a Paralympian, Sato Mami, Tani Mami, also known as. And gave a speech that set the tone and for how the bid was all kind of framed around recovery from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, and then the nuclear meltdown. And so those recovery ideas, but her talk about kind of the importance of sports, kind of, and how it shaped her life, how her experiences she was from the region that was hit by the tsunami. So how sports kind of was such an important part of that. And so just the fact that you had a Paralympian speaking before the prime minister, before the Japanese Olympic Committee chair, so this is, a remarkable kind of development in terms of the Paralympic movement in Japan. So you go from, taking patients right out of the hospital in some ways and having them participate to a situation where you've got professional athletes that are kind of international spokespeople. And that's, a huge transition in less than 60 years, really, is what we're talking about. That's pretty remarkable in the span of what we're talking about. So, so two stories that kind of bookend this stuff nicely.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much. Terrific.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciated it.